Hello everyone, today we talk about Canadian warfare. This is really the first video of ever about the topic of a series that mostly here I've prepared for 18th, from the 16th century onwards, mostly covering 18th, 19th century warfare. Then of course we will get also more contemporary Canadian warfare. We really have to expand to a lot of sort of the last centuries. That, as you know, Schwerpunkt we haven't quite done, but I thought that starting from also fairly in-depth stories here from the first European settlement in North America to more or less like the beginning of the 7 Years' War, so mostly the aftermath of the War of the Austrian Succession can be an important first step through also the War of the League of Augsburg, King William's War. Looking at the history of Canada, or better, Canada, like at this point. So let's simply go with it because there is a lot of information. Let's not waste time about it. So in the 40s of the 16th century, Europeans first established the enduring settlements in North America. I'm not going to make videos for now about like the very earliest settlements. European settlements in North America, aside from the Vikings. We said something about that, but we really have to come back on sort of a broader perspective on this topic that is too often anecdotally treated. What interests today us is the region now known as Quebec, as far as Canadian history is concerned. And it wasn't not until the early 17th century that this territory, known as Nouvelle-France, so New France, managed by the Company of New France. It was a private venture, like many Europeans, as you know, used to first settle by, in fact, private means that eventually would be taken over by the same governments, started to grow beyond a few thousands inhabitants, living in essentially small hamlets along the river St. Lawrence. These communities faced periodic raids by the Iroquois tribe that, as we'll see now, was pretty, unfriendly, which led the Sun King, Louis XIV, to bring Nouvelle-France under direct royal control from Versailles itself in 1663, right, appointing a governor to serve as both political and military leader. We just recently made a video about the youth of Prince Eugene in Paris. So this is actually more or less the same context across the Atlantic from Versailles. In fact, there is even a Savoyard connection. In 1665, the Carignan-Salières regiment was a Savoyard one from France, was dispatched to Nouvelle-France to counter the Iroquois threat. So what did really this regiment do? Because we have seen also in the video about British strategy of the 7 Years' War that will in part overlap with especially like the following episode from this series. The difference probably like regular forces, right, professional troops like regiments would make in theaters like this ones, where just even a few of these troops could really make a regional difference, given that, as we'll see now, that was essentially just militia controlling the frontier, and also, in fact, other few troops of that kind from the British side as well. So the Carignan-Salières regiment dispatched to New France in 1665 under Louis XIV's orders, as the king was definitely worried that the Iroquois could become a bit too aggressive, aimed to curb this threat, particularly from the Iroquois Mohawk group that was probably the most aggressive of the so-called Five Nations that comprised these peoples. The Carignan-Salières regiment comprised approximately 1,200 soldiers and 80 officers. The regiment arrived in Quebec City between June and September 1665, led by Lieutenant General Alexandre de Prouville de Tracy, the governor Daniel de Remy de Courcelles, and the Colonel Henri de Chastelard-de-Salières. Their mission involved fort construction and military expeditions to secure the colony. Upon arrival, the regiment prioritized fortifying the Richelieu River, a tributary of the St. Lawrence River, as a primary Iroquois invasion route. Between August and October 1665, they constructed Fort Saint-Louis, later Fort Chambly, Fort Sainte-Thérèse, and restored Fort Richelieu, while also building Fort Saint-Jean and Fort Sainte-Anne on Île-la-Motte by spring 1666. These forts served as defensive strongholds and supply bases for subsequent campaigns. The first major military engagement occurred in January of the same year, led by Governor Courcelles. Targeting Mohawk villages, the expedition involved 600 French soldiers and 70 Canadian militiamen. Lacking snowshoes, winter clothing, and Algonquin guides, the troops became lost in deep snow. Right, we'll not talk too much about the coureurs de bois and sort of the interesting frontier culture that developed in Canada, just in some more sort of anthropological and individual sense. But at some point, we could make, for example, a historical military unit video on such. Also, half-bloods, by the way, between the Indians and the French. But not specifically going to talk about this now. In any case, the campaign was actually a disaster, right? With 60 soldiers dying from exposure or starvation. The North American climate in that at that latitude, in particular, with that kind of hinterland, especially, was not really, a very hospitable place. There was also actually no significant military contact with the Iroquois either, right? Basically just a bunch of ambushes, but small engagements, really. The Mohawk, aware of the French advance, avoided themselves engagement, retreating to inland forests. They understood what these Europeans, but this is also very interesting, like how the Indians were, of course, very knowledgeable about what actual European warfare was about, but by that point, regardless of the infrequency, in fact, of these more professional forces and dealing mostly with militiamen. In September 1666, Tracy led a second, larger expedition with 1,200 men, including 600 regiment soldiers, 600 militiamen, and 100 allied Wendat and Algonquin warriors. Departing from Fort Sainte-Anne, they marched towards Mohawk territory near Lake Champlain. The Iroquois, weakened by a smallpox epidemic, very contextual in the era and the places, had abandoned their 4 villages. Finding them deserted, the French burned long houses, fields, and corn reserves, disrupting Mohawk resources. On October the 17th, 1666, Tracy's forces conducted a symbolic ceremony, claiming the territory for Louis XIV. While no direct combat occurred, the destruction pressured the Iroquois towards peace. Peace negotiations, initially stalled in December 1665 due to Mohawk absence, resumed in July 1667. The Mohawk, facing epidemics, as we've seen, ascending to the throne, treaty was signed on July the 10th, 1667, establishing an 18-year peace with the 5 nations, known as the Great Peace of 1667. This treaty allowed new fronts to stabilize and grow, reducing the immediate Iroquois threat. So incisive, or had not really been needed in this particularly direct combat, demonstrated still French military resolve, contributing to the same peace agreement. By 1668, most soldiers returned to France, by the way, but as we will see better now. But around 450 remained, settling along the St. Lawrence, often marrying the filles du roi, so to say, and bolstering the colony's population and defenses. By the way, for the record, the filles du roi were essentially like the French women numerically, like from 700, 900 that between 1663 and 1673 emigrated to New France under the direct monetary sponsoring of the Sun King, so that they could get married and starting new families. So in the effort, like this is very interesting, to properly demically colonize Nouvelle France in North America. This again is particularly important because it really shows how much, of course, the French cared about this colony to be reinforced and to be a cornerstone of their global dominion. After the regiment's departure in 1668, New France's defense depended on the so-called Les Compagnies de Marine, so the companies of the Navy, that was actually a newly formed local militia system. The former were in fact not actual naval marines, I mean professional embarked troops, but soldiers enlisted in France under the Ministry of Marine, which handled colonial governance. As you know, France was at this point sort of greatly investing in this more like sort of centralized ventures, also to stimulate also shipbuilding, like under Colbert, etc. And so this Compagnie de Marine represented, as a consequence, also the earliest form of an organized militia in Canada. Of course, there were already, as we've seen, colonists, settlers that were armed, and they had de facto that they acted as a militia. But these Compagnie de Marine were specifically established at the realization, of course, New France was gaining importance. The irregulars had basically mostly come back to France and or married, as we've seen, to the local women. So now something more consistent had to be established. This Canadian militia consisted of all able-bodied men in a designated area, so very typically like Romano-Germanic tradition, based on local district, like typically a church parish. So everybody, every able-bodied man capable of bearing arms was basically eligible for militia service. Consider that on the frontier that these people would be just normally involved in some kind of raids and general throat cutting, like shooting at the Indians, defending their farms, etc. The militia's primary role was to protect their homes, in fact. But volunteer units supported regular French troops as scouts as well. There were the voyageurs, moving supplies by water, for example, in this rich waterway net that, in fact, largely made up for the absence of roads in Canada at the time. As well as garrisoning outposts, obviously. This is very interesting, of course, even in a micromanaging sense, how these individuals would actually go out there with pretty perilous ventures to maintain their poor but still promising life in the colonies. Now, unlike professional soldiers, this militiamen would obviously lack training or equipment for the era's linear battle formations. I made multiple videos about linear tactics, and we explained how gradually developing they were actually still at this point, but that of course were very effective, mostly in the great open fields of Europe, like where major, in fact, motherlands would go muscle to muscle, like with very large quantities of regulars since centuries and centuries. The frontier was different, right? And there, the militiamen would prove, would be just, again, subordinated to the regular infantry regiments, but still being effective as skirmishers and guerrilla fighters against the English, right? The already hated enemy, and their Iroquois allies, as well. And this would be, again, just stemming out of the lifestyle of these frontiersmen. Let's talk a bit about the War of the League of Augsburg, because we start seeing some more concerted action between these regulars and the militia. This is also known as King William's War. It lasted between 1689 and 1697. It had interesting developments in Northern America. War broke out in Europe in June 1689, and the governor of Nouvelle-France, Frontenac, secured permission at that point for a combined assault on the English colony of New York. This is particularly relevant because already New York held a pretty strong significance among the English colonies, and seizing it would have given the French de facto dominance over the entire New England, and consequently, in turn, the entire North American fur trade at that point, really opening avenues to a broader domination of the continent, taking over also some of the other growing powers in the same. In spring 1690, multiple raiding parties set out from New France. With that, as we've seen, coureurs de bois, which means forest runners, basically, bias. One of these raiding parties advanced as far as Schenectady, while two others targeted Fort Loyal, that is now Portland, Maine. These are interesting actions, not enormous ones, but still consistent and actually very brutal to describe. A force of 210 men, 114 French-Canadian militia, and 96 Montagnais Algonquin and Mohawk warriors led by Jacques Lemoine de Sainte-Hélène and Pierre Lemoine d'Iberville departed Montreal, traveling over 250 miles on snowshoes down the Richelieu River and Lake Champlain. They reached Schenectady, a poorly defended village of 25-30 homes. At 11 p.m., under cover of a snowstorm, the raiders attacked, catching the settlement unprepared. Gates were open and sentries were absent. The assault lasted 2 hours, with houses burned, 62 settlers killed, including women and children, by the way, and 27 prisoners taken. That's how raw and merciless frontier warfare actually was. Never think that simply in relative terms, fringe warfare is less vicious than sort of major conflagrations, right? These militiamen were as hungry and angry, at one another as it could get. Naturally, livestock and goods, so the precious surplus that everybody was breaking their backs at home for, were plundered. The raiders spared some Mohawk allied families and left a few homes unburned to signal selective targeting. Imagine the ambiguity also in the relation with the Indians that lived straddled these territories and lived even in some groups connected with actually different political affiliations at the same time. Pursued briefly by Albany militia, the raiders returned to Montreal with minimal losses, by the way, though 17 men died from exhaustion or exposure during the retreat, just again to stress the climatic, environmental background of all this. The raid sowed terror across New York's frontier, by the way, exposing English vulnerabilities. François Hertel led 52 men, 25 French-Canadian militia and 27 Abenaki warriors from Trois-Rivières, traveling 180 miles down the Connecticut River. At dawn, they struck Salmon Falls, that is now Berwick, Maine, a small settlement of 30 houses. So we are, as you understand, also in today's far northeast of the United States. This was a settlement of 30 houses, barely also. The raiders burned the village, also here, killed 34 settlers and captured 54, mostly women and children. At this time were at least spared. We were, however, marched to Quebec for ransom or adoption by indigenous allies. I mean, think about these people's stories, right? This is unspeakable. The attack was swift, also on this occasion with minimal French losses. On their return, Hertel's party ambushed an English relief force as well from Portsmouth near Wooster River, killing 8 to 12 and wounding others, further humiliating English defenses. The raid disrupted New England's northern frontier and bolstered French-Abenaki alliances. A larger force of 400-500 men, including Canadian militia, Penobscot and Abenaki warriors, led by militia captains Joseph François Hertel de la Fresnière, René Robineau de Portneuf, and Augustin Le Gardeur de Courtemanche, descended the Kennebec River from Quebec. They targeted Fort Loyal, a wooden stockade in Falmouth, so now Portland, Maine. As we said, garrisoned by 70 to 100 English troops under Captain Sylvanus Davis. After a 5-day siege, the fort's defenses crumbled under relentless musket fire and fire arrows, by the way, from the French and the Indians and the Indians respectively. On May the 20th, Davis surrendered, by the way, expecting quarter. However, after the surrender, the attackers massacred 200 settlers and soldiers, sparing about 20 prisoners only, including Davis, who were taken to Quebec. The French were really ferocious, and so, of course, also their allies. Now, the fort and surrounding settlement were burned, effectively depopulating Maine's frontier at the time. The raid showcased the effectiveness of combined French indigenous forces and intensified English colonial fears. In response, as we will see now, the British launched a naval attack on Quebec, synchronized with an overland push up the Hudson River towards Montreal. Right, so this basically went down in October 1690 when a force of about 1,300 New England militia led by Sir William Phips disembarked just north of Quebec, where the city's fortifications were least robust. We've seen this also in the video about the British strategy of the 7 Years' War. That's just, however, for another video again. The militia, however, could not really reach the city itself, as several hundred Canadian militia and indigenous fighters ambushed them from thick forests. Smallpox soon ravaged Phips' own encampment, forcing the expedition to retreat within a week. Right, so this was a bad expedition, to say the least. A bit more in detail, Massachusetts had appointed Sir William Phips. Like, this was essentially a former privateer to lead a naval expedition against Quebec, the heart of Nouvelle France. Phips sailed from Boston on August 9, 1690, commanding 34 ships, so 7 warships and 27 transports, and 23 to 2,500 men, mostly New England militia, by the way. The fleet reached the St. Lawrence River by October the 10th, anchoring near Quebec on October the 16th. Phips sent envoys demanding surrender, but Frontenac, commanding 3,000 troops, including the aforementioned Troupes de la Marine militia and 200 to 300 reinforcements from Montreal and Trois-Rivières, famously replied, "I have no reply to make to your general other than from the mouth of my cannons and muskets." On October the 18th, Major John Whalley landed the 1,300 militia at Beauport, north of Quebec, planning to ford the St. Charles River and assault the city. However, 400 Canadian militia and Montagnier warriors harassed the landing with accurate musket fire from wooded cover. As you imagine the tactical context of that. This disrupted English cohesion. Over 3 days, Whalley's forces endured relentless skirmishes, by the way, losing something like between 30-50 men to gunfire and smallpox already, which in fact had been ravaging the fleet. since the beginning, and Phipps warships bombarded Quebec's riverfront, but French batteries, including 8 guns at Chateau Saint-Louis and 6 18-pounders at the docks, returned fire, expending most English ammo with little effect, really. The plan to cross the St. Charles faltered due to tidal constraints, generally speaking, poor coordination. 4 ships failed to support the crossing, and landing boats never arrived, really. By October 21st, 22nd, Wally's force, demoralized and low on supplies, thus retreated, as we've seen, quite just after a week, abandoning 5 of 6 cannons, by the way. Phipps, facing smallpox, food shortages, and an approaching winter, negotiated this prisoner exchange and sailed for Boston on October the 25th. The expedition suffered 30 combat deaths, but shipwrecks, disease, and smallpox raised English losses over to 400, with costs exceeding £50,000, which, as you understand, especially for an economy like the Massachusetts one, was a financial disaster. We're talking the end of the 17th century. Quebec's natural defenses, Frontenac's preparations, such as wooden palisades and 11-stone redoubts, and Canadian militia tenacity secured a French victory. Right, and there was the second prong, however, that we mentioned, like led by the Connecticut militia and their commander, Fitzjohn Winthrop, as well as Captain John Schuyler, aiming to attack Montreal via the Hudson River and Lake Champlain. This expedition assembled 855 men, including 400 New York and Connecticut militia and 400 to 500 Iroquois warriors at Albany in August 1690. However, also in this case, smallpox, supply shortages, and disputes among officers caused most Iroquois and militia to desert, leaving Schuyler with 150 to 200 men only. On September the 4th, Schuyler's reduced force raided French settlements south of Montreal in retaliation, including La Prairie, killing 50 inhabitants, burning houses, and capturing 19 prisoners. Too weak to assault Montreal's garrison, Schuyler retreated before French militia could respond. The raid caused minor damage but failed to threaten Montreal, as the Iroquois offensive promised by New York never materialized, weakened by prior French attacks, as we've seen. Frontenac redirected Montreal's 200 to 300 troops to bolster Quebec's defense, further thwarting English plans. In this way, the ongoing North American conflict between France and England dwindled into sporadic raids and skirmishes until the Treaty of Ryswick, concluding the war in 1697, but not the same conflict. Passing at the War of the Austrian Succession, so King George's War, from at least a British perspective, 1744-48. You know that here and there we talk about these wars, not maybe just dedicating entire videos about that, but talking about, I don't know, the Prussian military, the French, still say French continental warfare, at least old continental warfare at this point. We have sort of addressed many of these chapters, also with some doctrinal terms, etc. I promise we will get more thoroughly into 18th century warfare. In any case, you understand here time has passed, like a couple of generations, so that in these decades, France steadily bolstered its North American presence, showing how important really this was for her strategy, and how couldn't it be. Nouvelle-Orléans was established in 1718 at the Mississippi River's mouth. In the north, Montreal's defenses were reinforced, and Fort Niagara was built in 1725. Right. The grandest undertaking was, however, the fortress of Louisbourg on what is now Cape Breton Island near Nova Scotia's eastern tip. If you look at it on the map, this was completed over nearly 2 decades with formidable defenses, but this was the point. No naval fleet to contest what was mounting at that point is British maritime trade and power. All right. But looking at this military defenses also from a strictly engineering point of view, also how they were manned, so how much did the French actually invest into this overseas defense maintenance is quite fascinating. So founded in 1718, as we've seen, by Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne de Bienville at the mouth of the Mississippi River, Nouvelle-Orléans, New Orleans, served as a trade hub and defensive anchor for French Louisiana, of course named after the Sun King. Its early defenses, Louisiana, by the way, was like the entirety, basically like central, southern American, North American French possession. That would be reduced to the state we know today. But it was like this enormous land of Louis, right, in the interland, right, of North America, where in perspective, you understand the English had actually seized some of the best colonies on the Atlantic. Now, its earliest defenses were, that we're talking here, Nouvelle-Orléans, were modest due to the swampy terrain and limited resources of the area. By the 1720s, a wooden palisade with earthen embankments encircled by the settlement, supplemented by a shallow moat. Small batteries of 4 to 6 cannons, mostly 6 and 8 pounders, guarded the riverfront to deter naval incursions. The city's low elevation made it vulnerable to flooding, by the way, complicating fortification efforts. By the 30s of the 18th century, plans for a star-shaped fort were drafted, but not fully realized until later. Check out the video made about Vauban's fortifications at this era. Living defenses at that point reliant, however, the natural barriers like the marshes and the Mississippi's currents that, to some effect, were actually pretty useful. The garrison was small, typically 100 to 150 troupes de la marine, that, as you understand, were not just in fact deployed in Canada, but that actually came from Canada. If you wonder why we're talking about New Orleans here, because they had a connection with that. In fact, as we explained, these were colonial troops under the Ministry of the Marine, not naval marines, and they were French-born or Canadian soldiers. Admittedly, as often poorly supplied, with low morale due to harsh conditions and being sent to the far south and in a weather was arguably worse than the north. A local militia of 50 to 100 able-bodied settlers, including free black and Creole men, supplemented the regulars. Indigenous allies such as the Choctaw provided scouts and warriors during wars like, for example, the Natchez War, 1729-31. At some point, we'll talk about these things. On that occasion, for example, 400 to 500 French and Allied troops crushed this natives' resistance. The garrison's primary role in New Orleans was policing the frontier and protecting against mostly Spanish, that were just next door, British naval threats, though no major engagement occurred in this period. Speaking of Montreal, so back to Canada, this was, historically a fur trade center, an administrative hub for New France as well, and it faced threats from, as we've seen, the Iroquois raids and potential British invasion, as we've seen via Lake Champlain. By the 10s of the 18th century, Montreal's defenses were upgraded from earlier wooden stockades. Some of these settlements, as you understand, it had really been born in very humble ways. Up to this point, were actually pretty small things. A stone wall began in 17th 17 and completed in the 30s of the 18th century, enclosed the town, featuring something from 8 to 10 feet high ramparts, it was not a few, 5 gates, and 11 bastions. This was a more appropriate defense. The wall mounted 20 to 30 cannons, mostly 12-pounders, for anti-infantry defense, as you understand, mostly for the warfare of the era. The citadel of Montreal, a fortified hilltop position, housed additional artillery and served as a command post. Fortifications along the St. Lawrence River included small batteries to repel amphibious assaults as well. The Richelieu River forts, for example, Fort Chambly, acted as an outer defensive line rebuilt in stone by the 20s of the 18th century. Montreal's garrison consisted of 200 to 300 troupes de la marine organized into independent companies of 50 to 60 men each. These troops were professional, but often understrength due to desertion or disease. The Canadian militia, numbering from 1,000 to 1,500 able-bodied men from surrounding parishes, was critical. Militia units, led by local captains, trained sporadically and excelled as skirmishers using guerrilla tactics honed in earlier wars. Indigenous allies, including Wendat and Algonquin, contributed something between 100 to 200 warriors during campaigns, serving as scouts or raiders. The garrison focused on rapid mobilization to counter Iroquois British threats with no major assaults on Montreal itself during at least this specific period. Finally, the fortress of Louisbourg, the most important on Cape Breton Island's eastern coast, it was really the most ambitious North American French stronghold built between 1719 and the 40s of the 18th century. Designed by military engineer Jean-François de Verville and later Sébastien Leprêtre de Vauban's principles, it was a star-shaped fortress with 30-foot-high stone walls, 6 bastions, including the King's and Queen's bastions, and a deep ditch. The fortress mounted 148 cannons by the 40s of the 18th century, including 24 and 36-pounders for coastal defense and 12-pounders for landward threats. The citadel within the King's Bastion housed barracks and a governor's residence. Outlying batteries like the Island Battery, 28 guns, and Royal Battery of 31 guarded the harbor. The town enclosed by the fortress had 4,000 to 5,000 civilian inhabitants. Despite its formidable design, Louisbourg lacked a naval fleet, relying on privateers or French ships from Europe, making it vulnerable to British maritime blockades. Poor construction, such as shot mortar, rushed work, and harsh weather as well, eroded walls requiring constant repairs. Louisbourg's garrison was the largest in New France, with roughly 700 troupes de la marine, in peacetime rising to 1,300, 1,400 during wartime. For example, during the siege of 1745, we'll see now. These troops, organized into 10 to 12 companies, were better equipped than mainland garrisons with muskets, bayonets, and artillery training. A Swiss mercenary unit, the Cara Regiment, 100 to 150 men, bolstered the regulars, valued for discipline but prone to desertion. The local militia, 300 to 500 settlers, provided auxiliary support, manning walls or supplying labor, but lacked combat training. Indigenous Micmac allies, numbering 100 to 200 warriors, conducted reconnaissance and harassed enemy landings. The garrison's primary role was to defend the fortress and protect French Atlantic trade, particularly cod fisheries. No major engagements occurred during construction, but tensions with nearby British Nova Scotia, that is, Annapolis Royal, foreshadowed future wars like the 1745 siege, which is essentially like also the most important picture here. In 1744, France joined Spain's war against Britain, termed the War of the Austrian Succession in Europe. And as you know, had to do with essentially the recognition of the succession of Maria Theresa's right to the inheritance of her father's throne. And we talk about that it's one of the most important wars of the 18th century, notable just among the various things for Frederick the Great's initial major campaigns. So again, as I said before, we'll talk about this in all its vast complexity in another video. I even made a video about the papacy during the same era, which is actually very important. It tells you also about the complexity of the political diplomatic background. A French attempt, however, going back to Canada, to capture Annapolis Royal on Nova Scotia's western end failed, right? This is a very interesting campaign because essentially after Britain declared war on France, where in March of 1744, really the season begins, French authorities in Louisbourg, led by Governor Jean-Baptiste Louis Le Prévôt Duquesnel, sought to disrupt British control in Nova Scotia. Annapolis Royal, weakly garrisoned and isolated, was an inviting target. Capturing it would weaken British maritime influence, essentially secure Mi'kmaq and Acadian loyalties. There is all an incredibly complex relation of native tribal affiliations here with the major European continents, and protect French fishing and trade routes. Duquesnel planned a surprise attack leveraging local Acadian discontent and Mi'kmaq alliances to overrun the fort before British reinforcements could arrive. In July of the same year, Duquesnel dispatched a force from Louisbourg under François Dupont du Vivier, a troupe de la marine officer with experience in guerrilla tactics. The expedition comprised approximately from 70 to 100 French regulars, troupes de la marine, and 200 to 300 Mi'kmaq, Malizet, and Abenaki warriors, rallied by missionary priest Jean-Louis Le Loutre, who incited anti-British sentiment among indigenous groups and Acadians. It's very interesting to see how these, of course, the natives were being Christianized, but it's interesting even just as these Catholic priests held sway over the moral dimension of the Indians. It's really fascinating. The force sailed to Baie Verte, then marched overland to avoid British naval patrols that were dangerous, arriving near Annapolis Royal by late August. A second smaller attempt followed in September, involving about 50 French troops and 200 indigenous warriors aiming to capitalize the first assault's momentum. Annapolis Royal's defenses centered on Fort Anne, a star-shaped earthwork fort with 12-foot-high ramparts, a dry moat, and 4 bastions. The fort mounted from 16 to 20 cannons, mostly 12 and 18-pounders, but was in disrepair with crumbling walls and inadequate supplies. The town, sparsely populated, offered little additional protection. The British garrison under Governor Paul Mascarene numbered only, 120 regulars from the 40th Regiment of Foot, by the way, and 20 to 30 local militia, mostly English settlers. Mascarene was a Huguenot with engineering expertise, had reinforced the fort's palisades and stockpiled provisions, anticipating French raids. It's very interesting, again, that you have this Protestant French, literally like Huguenots, were not really dead eventually, but since the revocation of the last revocation of the definitive one of the Edict of Nantes, had passed years, but these confessional, let's say, rivalries had continued well into the mid 18th century. Acadian neutrality limited local support, though some provided intelligence to the French. As we've seen, this was fairly transversal, as you have understood. The first attack occurred between August the 24th and September the 5th. Duvivier's force, totaling, as we've seen, from 300 to 400 men, approached Annapolis Royal covertly, using forest cover to encircle Fort Anne. On August the 24th, Mi'kmaq and Malizet warriors launched probing attacks, harassing British sentries and burning outlying homes to terrorize the garrison. Duvivier planned a night assault to exploit the fort's weak eastern rampart, but lacked artillery to breach walls. Over several days, French regulars and indigenous allies exchanged musket fire with the garrison, killing 2 or 3 British soldiers and wounding a bit more. Mascarene's disciplined defense, using cannon fire to deter close assaults, frustrated the attackers. The French attempted to undermine the walls with saps, so trenches, but heavy rain and militia counterattacks disrupted progress. By September the 5th, Duvivier, short on supplies and fearing British naval reinforcements, withdrew to Minas Basin, suffering 10 to 15 losses, mostly indigenous warriors, by the way, to disease and skirmishes. The second attack occurred later in the month. A smaller force led by Duvivier and Le Loutre returned in mid-September with 250 men. This raid focused on guerrilla tactics, ambushing British patrols and cutting supply lines to isolate the fort. Mi'kmaq warriors killed or captured 6 to 8 British soldiers in hit-and-run attacks, but the garrison held firm, using artillery to keep attackers at bay. Lacking siege equipment and facing desertions among indigenous allies, Duvivier abandoned the fort within a week, retreating to Louisbourg. French losses were minimal, 5 to 10 men, but the raid failed to weaken Fort Anne significantly. So, in hindsight, the French attacks failed to capture Annapolis Royal due to inadequate manpower, lack of heavy artillery, and poor coordination between French regulars and indigenous allies. All right, likely any of this factor would have been enough to settle it. Mascarene's defensive preparations, including repaired fortifications and disciplined musket volleys, ensured the garrison's survival. The fort's artillery, though limited, deterred direct assaults. In the absence of a French naval blockade, especially allowed British supply ships to reach the fort, which during a siege is definitely like a nail on the coffin of the attackers. British losses, as we've seen, were fairly contained. We're talking about small engagements. In response, Mascarene requested reinforcements from Boston, which arrived in October 1744 with 50 to 100 troops and supplies, bolstering the garrison to 150 to 100 men. It sounds almost like a medieval, typical, medieval provincial reality by the size of troops. The British, and in fact, as I often say, the Middle Ages are also not that far away, just like a couple of 100 years. Now, the British also strengthened ties with the neutral Acadians, offering amnesty to prevent defections to the French. Governor William Shirley of Massachusetts, alarmed by the raids, began, by the way, planning a counteroffensive against Louisbourg. We'll see now culminate in the successful 1745 siege, and so that failed French attempt to galvanize British resolve to secure Nova Scotia, leading to increased naval patrols and fort repairs, by the way. They were the cornerstones, as you understand, of the operational logistical action. The unsuccessful raids highlighted also the same French logistical weaknesses, particularly Louisbourg's reliance on land-based forces without naval support, right? The Mi'kmaq and Malicet would continue guerrilla attacks on British outposts, but Annapolis Royal remained a British stronghold, anchoring Nova Scotia's defense. The episode escalated tension, setting the stage again for the 1745 war that resulted from a major blow to French ambitions in North America. And let's talk about this retaliation, this British-American assault on Louisbourg, where in the spring of 1745, this would succeed taking the fortress after a 6-week siege. And the war's final notable engagement occurred in November, later that same year, when a combined force of Canadian militia and indigenous fighters razed the town of Saratoga as well. So let's get a bit more into the details of this. Following French raids on Annapolis Royal and Canso in 1744, the aforementioned Massachusetts Governor William Shirley organized a colonial expedition to capture Louisbourg. right? France's mighty fortress on Cape Breton Island. Louisbourg's strategic position threatened, with this protrusion into the Atlantic, as well as securing British maritime trade and New England fisheries. The assault aimed to neutralize French naval power in the Atlantic and secure British dominance in the same Nova Scotia. The operation, led by merchant William Pepperell, by the way, was a rare joint effort between New England militia and the British Royal Navy, interestingly enough, also proving how important, of course, New England was for the latter, and especially from a logistical point of view. Like, you know that basically by the time of the U.S. War of Independence, Boston had become, the producer of 1/3 of the Royal Navy's tonnage, right? So we're talking about major resources now at stake through the same word, mostly like, as you know, the major settlement would be the 7 Years' War. In any case, the assault on Louisbourg aimed to neutralize French naval power in the Atlantic and secure British dominance. Logistically, the Americans were becoming ever more important and had ever more political leverage on these affairs. The British-American force assembled in Boston, in fact, comprised something like 4,300 New England militia, mostly from Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire, and 90 artillerymen, supported by a British naval squadron under Commodore Peter Warren. The fleet, departing March the 24th, 1745, included 13 warships mounting 400 guns, it's massive firepower, and 60-70 transports. On April the 30th, the force landed at Gabarus Bay, 5 miles southwest of Louisbourg, facing minimal initial resistance. The militia, organized into regiments, lacked formal training, but were motivated by plunder and anti-Catholic sentiment as well. Remember all the things we say about tradition surviving even in the most, in the newest worlds and newest eras, of course. The Navy blockaded the harbor, preventing French resupply. Louisbourg was, as we've seen, a star-shaped fortress with 30-foot stone walls, 6 bastions, a 100-foot wide ditch. It mounted 148 cannons, including 20 heavy guns, 24 and 36-pounders, and the Island Battery and Royal Battery guarding the harbor itself. The King's Bastion housed the citadel with barracks for 1,300 men. Secondary defenses included the Defend Bastion and outlying blockhouses. However, the fortress suffered from poor construction, such as the crumbling mortar, also, accomplice the harsh weather, low morale in general, and a weak harbor entrance. These are not good preconditions. The town within the walls had, as we've seen, 2,500 civilians. The garrisons under Governor Louis Dupont du Chambon numbered 560 troupes de la marine, 150 Swiss Carer regiment mercenaries, and roughly 900 civilian militia, totaling something like 1,500, 1,600 men. About 100 Micmac warriors provided reconnaissance but were not stationed inside, which was useful, at least as far as harassing the besiegers with this hit and run attack, but they were inconsistent at large. The garrison was understrength, with many soldiers sick or mutinous over unpaid wages, by the way. That's an interesting side of the story. And no French naval support available, which, again, was probably the major issue, also compounding all the others. The siege lasted from May the 1st to June the 17th. On May the 2nd, militia forces under William Vaughan captured the undefended Royal Battery, seizing 31 guns after French troops fled. Right, that's a lot, actually, even just as a moral first step, right? The British turned these cannons on the same Louisbourg, though inaccurate fire caused minimal damage. Apparently, naturally, we weren't there to fully see this, but at least these are they're decently documented encounters. The Island Battery with 28 guns remained a key obstacle, repelling early naval assaults with heavy fire. Pepperell's militia supported by 100 colonial artillerymen, established siege lines roughly 1 kilometer from the walls, digging trenches and erecting batteries. By May the 15th, they deployed 20 cannons, mostly, as we've seen, 18 24-pounders, and 6 mortars as well for their more arcuated parabolic trajectory, bombarding the Dauphin bastion and town. The militia's inexperience led to slow progress, but Warren's blockade starved the garrison of supplies. On May the 26th, a failed French sortie, 100 men to disrupt siege works, cost 20 defenders. Harsh weather and smallpox killed, in the meanwhile, like we're typically in 18th century warfare, something like 150 militia. But morale held. By June the 10th, British batteries breached the West Gate, and colonial engineers prepared a landward assault. Warren's warships bombarded the island battery, silencing its guns on June the 15th, facing starvation and desertions. In fact, 50 Swiss defected. Du Chambon surrendered, where on June the 17th, after 47 days of siege, the garrison marched out with honors, by the way, transported to France under parole, so the British recognized also the enemy valor. The siege succeeded due to British naval superiority, as we've seen, relentless bombardment, and French logistical failures. British-American losses were 150 killed, combat plus disease, 300 wounded, and 900 incapacitated, especially by smallpox. French losses were from 50 to 100 killed, 100 wounded, and 1,400 captured, including civilians. See how much, like, the offenders, like, of course, take more hits in the attack, but at the end of the day, also, if they make it, seize more, they inflict more losses to the enemy. The victory boosted British morale, secured Nova Scotia, by the way, and disrupted French trade, though Louisbourg was returned to France in 1748 under the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. As far as the French raid on Saratoga, instead, we are in November. It lasted a couple of days, 28th, 29th, and essentially the context is, as you understand, the French retaliation for Louisbourg's fall. So basically, the authorities in Quebec under Governor Charles de Beauharnois sought to strike British frontier settlements to divert resources and boost morale after the defeat. Saratoga, which is modern Schuylerville, after the former aforementioned commander, New York, was a lightly defended trading post 30 miles north of Albany. It was targeted to disrupt British-Iroquois alliances and terrorize the New York frontier. The raid aimed to replicate the success of earlier guerrilla attacks. The French somehow, had been better at than the British, but evidently not enough to spare themselves from such defeats. Leveraging, in fact, Canadian militia and indigenous warriors. The raid was led by Paul Marin de la Malgue, a seasoned troupe de la marine officer skilled in, again, this petit guerre, so the guerrilla, which is, again, actually a strong form of war, just it happens, like in this case, mostly because of stretched resources against enemies that are also not faring that better, telling the truth. His force comprised a bit more than 200 Canadian militia, bit more than 300 Abenaki, Mohawk, and Caughnawaga warriors, and bit more than 20 French regulars, totaling something like, between 500 600 men. Departing Montreal in early November, the force traveled 200 miles via Lake Champlain, moving swiftly on snowshoes and canoes to evade detection. The attack relied on surprise, exploiting Saratoga's isolation and weak defenses. Saratoga consisted of a small wooden fort, Fort Clinton, and a settlement of as you've seen, a few like tens of homes along the Hudson River. The fort was a 100-foot square stockade, literally it's that small, with 8-foot palisades, mounting maybe 5 light cannons, 3-pounders, and had a musket loopholes as well. Its garrison was meager. A few tens of New York militia and even less regulars, likely from the independent companies, by the way, totaling something like 30, 40 men. The settlement's 100, 150 inhabitants, including women and children, relied on the fort for protection during the fight. Poor maintenance and lax discipline left the fort vulnerable, there is no doubt. For example, there were no Iroquois scouts to warn of the French approach, for example, and so was somehow a relatively easy prey. On November the 28th, at dusk, Marin's force surrounded Saratoga, striking under cover of darkness. Indigenous warriors initiated the attack, scalping sentries, and setting homes ablaze with fire arrows, right? All the wildest savagery that objectively these troops were capable of. The militia, caught off guard, offered scattered resistance. It's a very small engagement, right? Firing muskets from the fort. Within hours, the settlement was, however, overrun. It's interesting that they held out, and it takes guts. 30, 40 settlers and soldiers were killed. 60, 100 were captured, including women and children, for ransom or adoption. The fort was burnt, its cannons spiked, and livestock and goods plundered. So every resource, human or animal, material, like was very important on the frontier. Marin's troops avoided a prolonged siege in this way, retreating by November 29th to avoid Albany's militia response. And of course, those guys were pretty angry at that point. French losses, by the way, were minimal. We're talking just several killed or wounded, primarily from stray musket fire, point-blank range from the palisades. So the raid razed Saratoga, by the way, killing or capturing basically half of its population and destroying a key frontier post. The attack exposed New York's weak defenses, sowing panic in Albany and undermining British-Iroquois relations as well. As some Mohawk joined the French, British losses totaled, as we've seen aforementioned, like some tens of dead and almost 100 captured, significant material damage. In response, New York Governor George Clinton reinforced Albany with 200 militia and requested British regulars at that point. The situation was really serious. However, no immediate counterattack occurred, because also what do? You chase these guys back into the wilderness? It's sort of dangerous. Now, the raid disrupted British plans for an offensive against Montreal, forcing a defensive posture. Marin's success reinforced, by the way, French reliance on guerrilla tactics that they were evidently good at, though by definition of guerrilla tactics, it did not alter the war's broader trajectory. And so basically, the Louisbourg victory strengthened British control over the Atlantic. That was way more important, paving the way for further colonial ambitions, while the Saratoga raid highlighted France's ability to strike deep into British territory with minimal forces. So it was basically a bit of revanchism, but also highlighting the inherent vulnerability, like general fragility of these colonial possessions in general. Both engagements underscored the, say again, was like this guerrilla aspects of the same. However, British naval militia superiority versus this French Indian guerrilla prowess, ultimately tilted in favor of the former. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, 1748, ended the war, restoring Louisbourg to France, but leaving frontier tensions unresolved, setting the stage for the French and Indian War that we talked about in that video about probably British strategy of the 7 Years' War, because the French and Indian War basically started just a few years and before this and overlapped with the 7 Years' War. So basically, as it was also escalated, and we'll see for this series of Canadian warfare into like the big deal of the outcome in that context. So again, the war ended in Europe in 1748, and this paradoxically returned Louisbourg to France in exchange for at least territories that France had seized in the Netherlands and India. Right, so as we explained in that video about British strategy, which also started a bit from these considerations at the end of the War of the Austrian Succession, were of course ever more global in nature. These were the decades in which the Royal Navy was truly like sort of muscling up to the masterpiece that we're all aware of. I really want to make a series also about the British Royal Navy to highlight this point. And so basically Louisbourg was not as important as what the French had as the tendentially hegemonic force in the old world achieved, like in the lowlands and in the Indian subcontinent. In 1749, France began reconstructing the same Louisbourg fortress. In response, the British forces founded the colony of Halifax at one of the eastern seaboard's premier harbor locations, so maintaining a presence in Nova Scotia. And this build up is interesting to look at in function as what we will see for Canadian warfare during the 7 Years' War, during the French and Indian War, basically. So the fall of Louisbourg in 1745 had really represented a significant blow to French prestige and Atlantic trade in general, particularly the cod fishery. Although the fortress was returned to France, as we've seen in 1748, reconstruction began in 1746 under under French control to repair damage, strengthening defenses, and prepare for future wars. The effort aimed to restore Louisbourg as a bulwark against British naval power in particular, and a base for privateering, while addressing prior vulnerabilities like poor construction and harbor exposure that, as we've seen, had been basically the reason why the French had lost it. So Louisbourg reconstruction focused on repairing the star-shaped fortress, which had sustained important damage in 1745. So all essentially the aforementioned defensive system was reinforced with improved mortar, like the quality probably of material, to counter weathering and bombardment. The King's Bastion house in the citadel was rebuilt with stronger barracks and a reinforced powder magazine to enhance firepower during counter battery fire during the siege. The Defend Bastion had been breached, as we've seen, so it was provided with thicker ramparts and additional musket loopholes, right, for probably close range, like repelling attack at close range. And this tells you how, of course, like at least musketry fire notoriously during this period would still cause most of the combat deaths. The Island Battery, 28 guns, mostly 24-pounders, and Royal Battery, 31 guns, 18 to 36 pounders, were repaired to protect the harbor, with stone casemates added for durability. By 1749, which was a fairly rapid timing, the fortress mounted 160 cannons, including 40 heavy coastal guns. Though plans for a permanent naval squadron were unfulfilled due to France's focus on European wars. This was still a secondary theater. Engineers led by Jean-Baptiste de Vallières, that, by the way, if you're really interested in, I made a video on the Vallières system during the 18th century, and we explained there what the entire deal of the reds and the blues and in the French military really were. Like, it's a major topic. The Vallières system basically changed Western warfare. Also, well, through the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars was basically surpassed only in the 1830s, right? Jean-Baptiste de Vallière added outer earthworks and redoubts to deter landward assaults. However, chronic issues persisted in Louisbourg. Shoddy workmanship, harsh winters eroding walls, and insufficient funding limited progress. The garrison during reconstruction numbered the usual 700 troupes de la marine, organized into 12 companies, supplemented by the Swiss Carrer Regiment mercenaries, regardless the fact that it had partially defected to the British. These troops were better supplied, however, than in 1745, with new muskets and artillery training, but morale remained low due to delayed wages and isolation. A civilian militia of 500 to 600 settlers, let's say, thrown from the town's 3,000 to 4,000 inhabitants, provided labor and auxiliary defense, though most lacked combat experience. Approximately 100 Micmac warriors served as scouts patrolling against British incursions from Canso or Annapolis Royal. The garrison's primary tasks were fort repairs, harbor defense, and training for potential sieges. No major engagements occurred during this period, but tensions with British Nova Scotia necessitated constant vigilance. It's also important to say that Vallière's intuitions during these vicissitudes of the French military can partially be observed here. Like, for example, we explained in that video how the French had pointed since basically Vauban's times on massive cannons that were mostly aimed at targeting and pounding down like the major fortifications of Flanders, for example, to unlock the stalemate, the strategic stalemate of that very hot theater of sort of European problem settlement, so to say. And they had neglected rapidity, flexibility, etc., in part also in sieges. We've seen how at Louisbourg in 1745 the British used mortars, for example. Well, the French had mortars, of course, but they had never really standardized those. They had never really cared that much. And because it was too close, right, of a weapon in many ways. But in a colonial context where, like in this case, like fortifications were tendentially smaller, all right, than in Europe, this disparity and this sort of French doctrinal tendency to rely on bigger pieces, but without sort of considering like sort of closer, sort of more surgical and flexible, in fact, given the unknown of war combat scenarios, brought them probably also to suffer at this point, because it's not just about what they learn in open field, because mostly about that was a great reliance, of the Prussians, of the Austrians. That's also where they learned from, of this sort of more tactical employment of artillery in open field, like to support units individually rather than long-range bombardment, like the French had remained somewhat stuck with like less uniform pieces and so on. It was probably felt at this point as well. Of course, it was not, again, decisive or anything that really determined what happened here at any relevant level. But like doctrine, military theory change on the basis also of these issues, by the way. So we can pass instead to the British founding of Halifax, which is also very interesting in this context. We're in 1749, and the return of Louisbourg to France in 1748 had naturally alarmed British authorities as far as the North American theater was concerned. In fact, the English sought a permanent counterweight in Nova Scotia to secure the region and deter French aggression, because as we've seen here, they had been able to take the province, but say political games, trading, land trade at the peace table had brought basically the French back in place. But the British could at this point still infiltrate in Nova Scotia, and they founded Halifax in June 1749 under Governor Edward Cornwallis. This location in particular of Halifax was strategically chosen for its deep, ice-free harbor, Chetbutko Bay, ideal for naval operations and trade, because at some point this Canadian river's gulfs froze, and that naturally was a problem, especially for the naval technology of the time. The colony of Halifax aimed to establish also properly the fortified military base that would allow to not just defend but also populate Nova Scotia with Protestant settlers. This was an important ideological struggle, as we've seen. The point was properly neutralizing French influence among Acadians and Mi'kmaq as well. There was a lot of work behind the scene with these Indians. Well, of course, also serving as a staging point for future campaigns against Louisbourg or Quebec, so with a strategically offensive purpose, of course. As you understand, all these forts, some of which were, as we've seen, really small, but were really pretty much all that existed in terms of European fortifications, like to serve, in fact, also European warfare in any consistent way, and they were also pretty scattered, so really also these geographical locations were very carefully chosen, and it would be interesting to make an analysis map at hand with that, but it's sort of relatively evident, and I remember that geopolitics is a hoax, and it's really strategy that matters in ways that literally go over nature, as also some of these very actions have showed. In any case, Halifax's initial defenses were rudimentary. They rapidly developed, though. By late 1749, a wooden palisade with 5 stockade forts, Fort Sackville, Fort Dartmouth, and 3 others, encircled the settlement, each mounting 6 to 8 cannons. So you have these protrusions that could support mutually one another and creating complications to the enemies that want to attack the palisades. The artillery pieces were mostly 6 and 12 pounders. You had a central citadel, was begun in the same 1749 on Citadel Hill, featuring earthen ramparts and a wooden blockhouse designed to command the harbor. By the mid-18th century, it housed 12 cannons and a small powder magazine. Harbor defenses included a battery at George's Island with 10 guns, 18-pounders, to repel French privateers. They also were normally operating like in these colonial scenarios. Again, the distinction between formal and informal, official and unofficial is pretty blurred, together with public and private, by the way. Engineers under John Bruce planned a permanent stone fortress, which was very costly, but would actually be completed in the 60s of the 18th century. Earlier defenses relied, however, on earthworks and timber, like it was typical of these initial settlements due to simply time constraints, of course, like resources. The harbor's natural depth and narrow entrance provided strategic advantages, allowing British warships to anchor securely. Outer blockhouses protected against Mi'kmaq raids, because they were always around, other nightmare of the settlers. That in fact brought to an intensification of the clash with the Indians in 1749-50, due naturally to French encouragement, because this is a proxy war. Halifax's garrison consisted of 1,200 British regulars, which actually was a lot considering the size of the settlement. So it was actually pretty military. It was a serious fort. These troops were primarily drawn from the 20th and 45th Regiments of Foot, rotated from Boston and Annapolis Royal. This is also quite interesting, also because being out there was not quite a settling experience, right? So these troops equipped with muskets and bayonets were disciplined but strained, in fact, by construction duties and disease, typhus, the other in the part of the corollary, the various things that could happen to you in the mid-18th century killed, in fact, 300 settlers in 1349. By the way, you die badly, right? It's better to be shot with a musket ball in the chest and maybe having a few hours of agony than going through typhus, really. So a colonial militia of 200-300 settlers drawn from the initial 2,500 immigrants, mostly English and German, interestingly enough, supported the regulars, though many were unstrained and focused on settlement tasks. About 50 to 100 rangers, led by figures like John Gorham, conducted counterinsurgency patrols against Mi'kmaq guerrillas. Again, their deeds are lost to legend, but we can imagine these scenarios to have been one of the single most shockingly violent in the annals of military history. Now, the Royal Navy maintained a permanent presence with 2-3 warships, like 50, 60 guns each, stationed in the harbor, providing artillery support and deterrence. The garrison's role was to fortify Halifax, protect settlers, and counter Mi'kmaq raids such as the 1749 Dartmouth attack, which killed 4 settlers. So again, small things, but still threatening enough for the numbers and the resources that were, again, fairly limited. No direct French assault, by the way, occurred on Halifax in 1749. The Mi'kmaq raids, yes, and there were French agents specifically brought to back the Indians. One of these figures was Jean-Louis Leloutre, which also was probably sent against Halifax with these auxiliaries to test British defenses, because also how do you actually spy on what the enemy does? You carry out this little attacks just for fun, but they are actually going to gain very expendable information. By the way, you never know whether there is like a golden opportunity here to do something with a favor of the darkness and a bit of luck. In September 1749, Mi'kmaq warriors attacked, in fact, a sawmill in Dartmouth, killing the aforementioned 4, capturing other 7, prompting Cornwallis to deploy rangers and fortify outposts. Imagine, what this, northern frontier could be, right? The gazes of these sentinels and their, rude and sort of well-practiced sort of sniping capacities, and it's really fascinating. British losses altogether in 1749, 50 totaled a few tens of dead from skirmishes and disease. The garrison's response included scalp bounties and aggressive patrols, so they were playing, of course, like the same game of the Indians, escalating tensions with them. Halifax's rapid fortification and naval presence deterred French naval raids, indeed solidifying its role as a counterweight to Louisbourg, right? And so, in the end, France's reconstruction of Louisbourg essentially restored its defensive capacity, but failed to address naval weaknesses, leaving it vulnerable to future sieges like the one we will see again of 1758. The fortress's garrison, though reinforced, remained isolated, reliant on European supplies, so literally the ones across the Atlantic. Halifax's establishment, despite early hardships, created a permanent British stronghold anchoring Nova Scotia and enabling the 1755 Acadian expulsion and later campaigns against French Canada. By the mid-18th century, Halifax's population reached 4,000, and its defenses, backed by the Royal Navy, ensured British maritime superiority. Both preparations intensified Anglo-French rivalry, foreshadowing the very bigger and especially more radical clashes of the French and Indian War. That we will see better. And again, it's interesting in the next videos because it's interesting. We already talked about this. It's it's mostly about again overlapping. In fact, we had never talked about North American warfare, and that we ended up making a couple of videos about this in maybe just when was it, like a couple of months. I think it's very, very useful for the channel. It's really where we want to go, and we'll see at this point how the audience responses as well. Because I don't know if you've noticed, but here for some reason we got a bit too few views lately. Like for several months, Schwerpunkt went great. We gained lots of subscribers. Now all of a sudden nothing changed. Actually, I'm making better videos. Even the video and the audio are much better than before because I improved some technical means. But and so yes, there's always Schwerpunkt's format that may not be the most thrilling, but at least there are also evidently much bigger factors outside that randomly played at this point. I don't know what YouTube is doing. But of course, I ask everybody to really share as much as possible because I have actually a very good CTR. So it seems really ridiculous that I have to to really acknowledge that my videos are watched by people who know that they exist. But literally, YouTube does not show this stuff around. So the subscribers, the followers are the only ones who have at this point the chance to make actually a massive contribution, because it would take just, I don't know, of the 27,000, maybe just one out of, I want to say 1,000, let's say 100 that shares this every day or comments on other channels, just to get really many views fast, many subscribers fast, and this is not happening. So let's actually work on it, because this is really important. This is really what we're looking at. And then it can happen, of course, at some point that the channel makes ups and downs, etc. But considering the potential we have, and considering the sudden surges of views whenever there is one specific topic that it may be also very randomly attracting, in the sense, the attention, you realize that this is really a matter of decision. It's not much a deterministic thing. And again, maybe it's just like the last videos. Some are really watched, really appreciated. Others, it's difficult. But we'll see what we can do here. Maybe this, especially a video like this, I think it will make more views than the average, that I'm sure. But it really depends on also what we can make in terms of other information here, other topics. And again, there is plenty of stuff to do. It's not easy at all, but we do go on, and we hope that, of course, this is going to be appreciated. We have actually lots of new interesting videos incoming. Some are very peculiar. Some are probably very also random. I like much more the more specific ones. I really like the ones that really get to the evenemential core, say, medieval European political affairs. And here we have to entrust ourselves a bit to the cycle choice, which always delights us with new with new challenges, and it's interesting. Let's simply go on with that. And the specials save a bit the day, admittedly, and fortunately we have plenty of them already prepared. So I'm really glad, at least, about my own organizational skills. Sometimes I can also not do anything Schwerpunkt related the whole day, with just recording this, and it's really a pleasure. So for today, stop it here. Naturally, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.